The third step to the cascade is to calculate how specific a rule is. Now, each of the different types of selectors have a specific value, and all of the selector values in a rule should be added together. Now, of course, this is not really adding, but once we have added all of these things up, the selector that has the highest number will win and will be applied. So the trick to calculating is that we're not really adding because we're not using a standard number system. The number system that we're using is based on a weighted system that essentially guarantees certain outcomes for more specific selector types. So we end up having a comma-separated number that has 4 different numbers, and the position of the number will determine how powerful that particular rule will be. So let's take a look at this. In the first space, we're going to have calculations and tallies for inline styles. So if we end up having an inline style, on its own, that number would end up being 1, 0, 0, 0. Now, inline styles is essentially as specific as you can get, and you cannot really overpower those inline styles. The second space is tallied for each ID used. So if we ended up having one ID applied to an HTML element, it would have the number of 0, 1, 0, 0. If we ended up having 20 IDs, it would end up having 0, 20, 0, 0. Because of the way that we tally and calculate, our inline style would win because it's more specific. It's got that 1. So if we had 20 IDs sitting there, it wouldn't matter because the innate nature of inline styles is to be more powerful than IDs. The third space is tallied for each class, pseudoclass, and attribute selector. So if we ended up having a pretty complicated selector using, say, a class, a pseudoclass, and an attribute selector, that would just end up having a tally of 3. So it would end up being 0, 0, 3, 0. In the fourth space, we tally for each type and pseudo-element selector. So if we ended up just targeting a p tag or an h1 tag, we would have 0, 0, 0, 1. However, if our selector contained 2 of our different type selectors, such as we were targeting a p tag that's inside of an h1 tag or something like that, it would end up having a 0, 0, 0, 2. And so you can see what I'm talking about here. I do have a sample. So this sample is page content, which is an ID, the type selector, which is a P, and then a class, which is highlight. So if I calculate all these up, we get a 0 in the first space because we don't have an inline selector. We get a 1 in the second space because we have an ID selector. We get a 1 in the third space because we're using a class. And then in the fourth space, we get a tally because we're using a p tag or a type selector. So as you can see, there really is this in-depth kind of complicated method to calculating how specific a rule is going to be to determine which rule will win. Now, once these calculations have been performed, then most conflicting styles will be resolved. However, if we have a continuing conflict that the calculation does not resolve, the last step of the cascade is performed. The placement of the rule is going to be taken into consideration, which is essentially when the rule is declared. So whichever rule was declared last or is closest to the HTML object will win, and its declarations will be applied. Now, if you take all of those different rules and steps and boil them down, you should have those quick steps that I mentioned at the beginning of this section. So those general guidelines more or less ring true with everything you've seen so far here. And essentially, that's the cascade. It is a series of very thorough checks that determine which conflicting rules get applied based on origin, weight, how specific they are, and where they were placed. It is definitely worthwhile for you to spend some more time examining how the cascade works, reviewing the order in which things are evaluated in, and becoming familiar with calculating how specific a rule is. Now, of course, I recommend this because it will come in handy when you need to troubleshoot your designs, because sometimes you'll make a declaration and it won't come out the way you thought it should, and by examining the cascade, you can figure out where the problem may be. Hopefully, this section has helped clarify what the cascade is all about and how it is performed. I do recommend that after you work a bit more with your cascading style sheets and applying those, that you come back and you view this section again, as well as other sections that I've talked about so far with the mechanics of CSS, because once you have some more experience with CSS, a lot of this is going to make a whole lot more sense. Now, with the end of this movie, it also draws this part of the course to a close. With all of the information on the fundamentals of CSS, selectors, property values, and the cascade, we should be well prepared to begin examining each area that we can manipulate with cascading style sheets.